Welcome to the session Grassland and Pasture, but maybe I will rename it to Grasslands. Pasture is a part of Grassland, and here in the session, more or less in the temperate grassland. And I'm Katrin Kuka. I come from the Julius Kühn Institute, and I'm the leader of the coordination staff unit Grassland, and due to the Julius Kühn Institute as a federal research center, I'm the responsible person for the Ministry of Agriculture for all questions concerning grassland, but I'm also a researcher, and mainly I have experience in modeling and in investigations of root-soil interactions. And so I will present today also overview of Germany and also some research results from my own work. The background is that we have grasslands cover around 28% of Germany's land agriculture area, and as you know, provide multiple ecosystem services, and they are central to both to agriculture productivity and climate mitigation strategies. And in the future, we will have different precipitation patterns, higher temperature, and more frequent extreme events. And for that, we have increasing pressure on grassland, also due to the intensification and herd expansion, with a shift towards to barn feeding in Germany, and therefore declining importance of grassland. And this is a risk for soil carbon, for the biodiversity, and for overall ecosystem stability. And the key questions what I have here: how can productivity and ecosystem services be balanced under changing climate conditions? Which management practice support the maintenance of grassland functions and resilience? And what role can grasslands play in the carbon farming and nutrient cycling? And I will address also here the agricultural soil inventory, insight from the biodiversity exploratory field experiment with a novel technique. I used micro-CT techniques to study the root-soil interactions, and then I will present some results from a simulation study. Yeah, as you know, grasslands provide a lot of ecosystem services, and in comparison to cropland, they due to the higher SOC sequestration, we have especially more regulation services. And these are always depending on site conditions, management, and climate. But we have also production services. On grasslands, we produce fodder, especially for livestock, but also raw material for biomass, for bioenergy and biochemistry. We have supporting services and culture services. So, and I don't know who was in the monitoring session, and we have heard that we lost a lot of carbon, especially in the grassland. Why we have so much carbon? We can also lose much of carbon, and for that we must focus also. It's really important that we foster also for the future a lot of carbon. For me, it was really impressive after the first sampling campaign that we have so much more carbon for the whole Germany part in the grassland, and it's depending on a lot of parameters. But we must keep in mind also that we have livestock on the grasslands, and keep in mind that we have also a lot of emissions due to the livestock on the grassland. And we must keep it in mind that we have the whole cycle. Yeah, and here on the left side you see a map where the cattle are distributed in Germany. We have much more cattle in Schleswig-Holstein and Bavaria, and much less cattle in the eastern part. Yeah, and this is here so normal cattle amount. And we have really different use of the grassland. In the north, as you can see here, we have much more pastures than in the south. The dark green is the extensive grassland. The more green are the pastures and the mount pastures, and the green is the meadows, and so that's north to south. And we have here more pastures and here more meadows where the cattle are in the barn. And one reason could be that we have not surrounded grasslands surrounding the barns. And another reason is that we have a herd expansion to increase the meat. That we have a expansion. That we have more livestock in the barn, and for that we have a decreasing of importance of grasslands. So the livestock or cattle were feeded often then with maize and soya, and not so with the grasslands. So. And I'm a little bit confused now. I can go forward. I think you know that we have also that we must look how we can foster the carbon farming, and also in the grassland. Why we lost a lot of carbon now due to the climate change, and also the loss of importance of grasslands. And now the next slides will be how we can enhance the soil and vegetation carbon storage. First thing is the land use. We can convert the arable land to permanent grassland. We can restore wetlands and peatlands. Then the grassland management is really important, but for that we don't know everything. So some research is needed, but food measures could be species rich and legume-based mixtures and improved rooting systems. And then we can look on the livestock management, also select breeds with low methane emissions, and to the nutrient and soil management. Yeah, and in general, we need more input and less output. And these are also some measures how we can do that. And it's really important that we have closed nitrogen cycles, while manure is not a waste, but a resource, and we should use all these things in the field, and all if some needed to apply mineral fertilizer. But in Europe, we have limitations of 170 kilograms per hectare. And this is also a problem in regions where we have a lot of livestock and there's a surplus, and in other regions we have not enough. And maybe it's not always good to transport that, but in shorter ways, it's also good to do that. We have closed nitrogen cycles, or not nitrogen alone, nutrient cycles. Now I come to a study which I have carried out inside the biodiversity exploratories. They installed the biodiversity explorators were established in 2006. And in each exploratory, in the Schorfheide, in the Heinrich-Dünen, and the Schwäbische Alb, there are 50 plots with a increased land use intensity. There are meadows, pastures, and non-pastures, which are fertilized and unfertilized. And there is a big consortium with different kinds of investigations. And I've taken undisturbed soil samples on all the plots, but I will present results from the part of the Schwäbische Alb, and for that I have used the micro-CT, where it's possible to look inside the soil and quantify soil parameters and root parameters together inside the undisturbed soil core. You can do it also in pots and do it twice or something like that. And with a combination of histogram analysis and space transformation, it is possible to quantify pore roots and solid parameters. And this is a 3D animation of one soil core for the groups inside this soil core. And there are also the quantified parameters. Now with my new CT, is it also possible to quantify it for different levels, root diameters, and so on. And for that, it is a little bit others than the results of Axel Dorn yesterday. I've received the results that we have much more roots in unfertilized plots, maybe due to its longer time that they are established. So if you have nitrogen inside the system, it's grow on the upper part and inside the soil. But here was the result that more roots are inside the soil. They are looking for nutrients, and for that we have more roots in unfertilized plots and really better structure. Then it's a little complicated, but this is the message of these slides. And then I come to a modeling study with the Global Change Experiment Facility. There are a lot of rooftops, and here we have quantified it for the extensive and intensive grassland sites that with the Kenny model. I see this one. Then I will a little bit faster. Here is the take-home message that we have much more yield in an intensive plot, but the increase after converting cropland to grassland was really similar. We have a little bit less carbon content in the future plots. We have much more nitrogen emissions in the intensive plots. So we store the same carbon and we lost more nitrogen in the intensive plot, but we have also more yields in the intensive plots. Yeah, for that, I come to my conclusion. Grasslands are key for climate mitigation via carbon sequestration and biodiversity support. And we have in intensive plots more yield, but higher end emissions. And in extensive plots, we have reduced emissions, but higher biodiversity services. So, and I think root systems are central here to sequester more carbon. Yeah, that's. Yeah, the other parts, I'm also the moderator of the session. Maybe one questions after each presentation will be good that we have it really after the presentation, and then we can go forward. Is there one question? No? Everything is clear? Then we have more time for the next presentation, which is given by Elaine Chambon. I don't know if it's right. And we hear a presentation, ruminant contributions to soil carbon stocks on the basis of a French case study. And Elaine is an agriculture engineer and specialized in environmental science, and she links her research to trials, carbon modeling, and advisory tools.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to present you some ruminant contribution to soil in France. So my presentation will be three parts. First, a short view on the climate context in France. Then the second part is how ruminant influence the carbon on the past decades, and then we will move to the next decades. So the context is plus 1.9 degrees in France compared to the last century, and we prepare plus 4 degrees for the end of the century. So even if we reduce by 30% our emissions, which is good, it's not enough to get to carbon neutrality. Emission sectors is the second emission sector in France, agriculture, and I'm going to focus on ruminants, which are contributing to 10% of national sector emissions. Ruminants, they are everywhere, as you can see here. Almost half of the farm have some livestock. So we developed 10 years ago a tool named Pastures, which is going to process the data collection for assessing the farm on greenhouse gas emissions, but also on biodiversity, nitrogen, and so on. And we make plans with the farm to decrease the emissions. For example, here it's in Brittany, the west part is dairy and beef intensive production. And here is the results, and you have the top list action of what farmers plan to do to decrease the impact on climate. And you can notice that it could increase carbon sequestration. Like for example, they are going to plant hedges, they are going to improve manure fertilization, they are going to introduce legume mixed crops, for example, and replace solar also is good. But at the same time, they are going to increase the cow productivity they reduce the number of heifers they have on farms, and that could, as they want to increase autonomy on feed, maybe some grassland will be put into crop. So there is two phases on that. And grassland in France, so we had an INRAE studies which calculate that actual management on grassland, permanent grassland field in France is beneficial for climate, carbon sequestration, with about 300 kilogram carbon being stored in that. And if we want to do more, we could convert maize silage in grassland lake, for example, and that would help to sequester 6 million more equivalent CO2 tons per year in France. Unfortunately, what we see is that livestock unit is decreasing in our country, and so on average, the grassland area is not increasing at all. It stays stable for the last 10 years, that's good. But in some part of the country, which is blue down here, the grassland area is decreasing. And where there is few grassland, it is increasing. So the balance is, we stay stable yet with 41% of the national land use area, which is dedicated to this land use. All right, so now the question is, how do cattle, beef, and sheep farm management influence soil carbon stock on average on the farm for the last decades? So to know more about this, we go back in at the farm we are used to work with, which are experienced farms or innovative farmers, and we check about 80 fields where we have got analyses from the 90s, 2010, 2010, yes, and now. So we can have an average trend on how the carbon evolute in the soil of this land, of this farm. So they are mostly in lowland region here. It's good managed farm, okay? They implement good conduct to decrease the water leaching over the pasture, nitrogen water leaching, okay? And when we treat the data, we can see that 70% of the field increased their carbon soil rate over the past decades, that is 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago, depending on the size. So that's good. And the grassland, the carbon rate in the grassland area increased. It's increased in carbon lay. It's the time in grassland used in the fields, okay, over the old period studies here. The longer time we had grassland, the better it was for increasing the carbon rates. And on the other part, the fields with more crops, maize, silage, and wheat, and a few time in grassland, to decrease carbon, but it's not maybe such a problem because we wanted to decrease also energy. So we reduced the manure put on that kind of fields also, which was too big. So at the end, we can see that the median of the increase is plus 0.15 grams of carbon by kilogram of fine earth. And if we suppose that bulk density didn't change on the period, can't check this, that would lead to an increase on carbon rates of carbon stocks of 6 per 1,000 on the period, the last 10 periods. That's for well-managed farm in lowland country part, okay? That leads now to having high stocks. That's 80 tons per hectare in this part. And we did also the measurements on carbon stock in the Alpine region here. And you can see that the stocks are even higher in this part of the country, and the higher the pasture are, the higher stock we get there. So it's very important to note that And when we did the measurement, we repeat 3 times the measurement at 20 meters to be sure of the stocks. And that's the average difference between 20 or 40 meters stocks. So on the lowland region and on the mountain region. So you can see it's very easy to have a difference of 20 tons of carbon per hectare from here to here. So we make the average of these stocks to implement now what is going to happen in the next decades. Okay, so we have when we discuss carbon improvement plan, we want also to introduce a discussion on how to sequester more carbon. So I can show you how we managed it. For an example of 4 plots in the Alpine region to change. One in the valley, one in the hilly, one in 30 altitude and more higher altitude. So with different kind of rain, the inner stock measure is this one, and that's the texture and pH. We'll get there. So we had the advisors to collect the data on what was happening for the last 5 years on these fields. And so they give us how frequently it is cut, what are the parameter cut, how are the grazing days, how is the manure applied, and mineral fertilization too, what is the crop rotation, or is it permanent pasture? And when we get that, we can make an average and just go online and have this 3-line axis to calculate tool, which is in high developed on the basis on Platformil initiative, study of terrain. And so we select the farm area, then you have the data from climate and soil that is proposed, but we change that with the measurement we did. So it's better for accurate results. And since you have done this step, you will have your results. And that's the average trend for the next 30 years. So you can see that sometimes fertility should increase, and in other cases it should decrease. Depends really on the fact you're considering. And what is really important for us is that the farmers are going to talk with the advisors about what to do. Okay, so on this region, for example, the just project on what was going to happen with less cattle on the area, so less manure input, for example, and they can try to compensate with more intermediate crops, the scenario is one, or they can also maybe think to change from Lucerne alfalfa short rotation to longer multi-species grassland 5 years. And as they have done this hub, you can have the results. With the active climate and the adaptation, this is the next climate period. Okay, so I just wanted to show that because it was very interesting discussion, and yes, I think it's very important to implement this. The conclusion, ruminants are everywhere in France, and they are rising rather on high level of stocks, thanks to grassland, but they are decreasing in number. So you see also that in some part of the region, there is decreasing in grassland. In lowland region, when we look at the farm, well, at the farm, they managed to increase their carbon rates, which is good news. It's not always so easy for the future protection. We can see that even in keeping the actual management in the high part of the mountains, we could decrease the stocks and can't do really anything with it because there is very low pressure anyway. So, and what is important, it seems to us, is to make link between all the tool on greenhouse gases emission and carbon sequestration tools to discuss these problems. Thank you for attention.
Thank you for the nice presentation. May I have a question? No, yeah.
Great presentation. Well, if I understood well, you indicated that we also measure over time that there is a very high variability in measurements. How do you account for that variability in the tools that you have the farmer? So do you provide an uncertainty to the estimation for the farmer, or how do you handle that variability?
Yeah, in fact, in the tool, most of the time the farmers, they don't have the stocks anyway. So when you select the area, it is linked to the database of national inventory in carbon stocks. And an average carbon stock is given for permanent grassland, grassland lay, or crops. Okay. But if you have your own measurement, like we did, you can select this value and put yours. So here I just put the average of the three something. If I had one, I would have done one, and that would give me an error. And if you want to have an idea of the error you make, you can just change the initial stocks. So you can plus or less 20 tons and see, and that's not sure. Okay. And what is really important for me is to have, it's not a real value, because that's not for carbon credit. It's just to discuss what to do, where to improve the manual management, how to say it's good to increase grazing, because grazing is decreasing in the real life. So it's that discussion. And it's relative trends. And for the farmer, they are interested in fertility, especially in low organic or low inputs.
Thank you.
So we're good on time. If there are any other
questions? So if one more question. No.
Isn't it good if the herd is decreasing because of less methane emissions from the animals?
Yes, that's always balance. So the decreasing of the light is helpful for methane at the average level. And that's the right way, but it depends how it is replaced. I mean, you can decrease and go from less intensive to more intensive system. So less grassland. That's one part of the country. Other part of the country is less livestock unit, but because stop with and go to cropping more profitable potatoes, and that's lots of mineralization. And in other part of the country, it is less livestock unit and less intensification. And they keep the pasture or increase the pasture for having more security in product. That's good. It's good for carbon sequestration. So it's difficult just in 10 minutes to see all the consequences.
Also because when you reduce soya and all the imported forage, that also lowers the emissions. So it's actually better. Even it sounds weird, but maybe it's better if the herd is decreasing. Even though it depends also on the kind of husbandry you opt for and the way the management you opt for,
Yeah, but you can also, not the slide, but we have a group of grazing farmers in the west of France, which is intensive production, and they said we decrease the milk production, so we don't import any soya. I can show you they have the same level of emission per liter of milk, but they use few fuels than the others. So it's the same by milk, but in the countryside, everywhere it's grassland. It's much better for the soil health. So it's more the way you drive your cows or your sheep that is important. And that's complex to explain very large.
It's not the cow, it's the home.
Yeah. No?
Thank you again. Now we will have an online presentation by Annette Freibauer. She is Vice President for Knowledge, Bavarian State's Research Center for Agriculture in Germany. Annette is a long-standing expert on greenhouse gas mitigation and carbon farming. And she was the coordinator, but we have a lot, where we had a lot of presentations of the inventory from the Thun Institute, where she was in former times, and she has a more than 20 long years experience in coordination and policy advice, and she served 3 times as an IPCC coordinating lead author. Welcome, Annette.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to share my thoughts with you. I stepped in quite on short notice, so unfortunately I didn't make it to come live to Berlin. So you see me just as a small point in the top of the presentation.
This is not
when we did
mode.
when we did the test, it worked perfectly. And I currently don't really understand why it doesn't this time. So before we lose a lot of time, I suggest that we try it this way. Because I just try it once again. There are moves on my screen, but not on yours. So now it works. Okay. Okay. So let's start. I was asked to bridge from the carbon in grasslands to farm and product carbon footprints. So happily, I immediately take on what Hélène said just a few minutes ago. So let's start. What have companies, researchers, and farms in common if you think about companies like McDonald's or high schools or universities or grassland farms, as we just saw also in the presentation of Hélène? In Germany, they have in common that they calculate the carbon footprint of the milk produced, and they all use the same greenhouse gas calculator tool, which is the climate check tool from us. And it uses harmonized routines, harmonized with the scientists across Germany, and also harmonized with international rules for greenhouse gas calculation. The background are many new obligations coming from industry, the Science-Based Targets Initiatives, which is a voluntary setting of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in companies along the entire production chain. Regulations that come from the international dairy federations, but also the carbon farming initiative of the European Commission and the new legislation on corporate sustainable responsibility. And quite recently, even from banks, which give cheaper credits to farms which do a greenhouse gas budget for their farm. And I will show you a little bit how the greenhouse gases in a farm are calculated, what are the important parts, and bring that in context with the carbon in the grasslands, and talk a little bit about the mitigation options on the farm. So the scopes we have to consider is first of all the farm itself, where we have the direct greenhouse gas emissions from various activities, including of course the soils. And we have two other indirect sources of greenhouse gas emissions to consider. First of all, the carbon footprint of the energy used in the farm, and as scope 3 also the carbon footprint of the input in the farm, for instance, the synthetic fertilizer or the feed that is that comes into the farm from abroad. So by doing that, we get a few economic values and also the greenhouse gases per cow, per farm, and also per kilogram milk. This looks a little bit complicated here. So my example here comes from some Bavarian farms. So a typical breed is the Fleckvieh, as you see the picture on the right-hand side. Let's first look at the annual milk yield per cow. It's around 8,000 kilograms of milk. This FPCM you see here is the fat and protein corrected milk, so a kind of standardized liter of milk. So 8,000 is quite typical, as these cows produce also substantial amounts of meat and are not the highest performing cows in terms of milk yield. A typical greenhouse gas value is around 1.2 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of milk. And you see the various sources of the greenhouse gases. A first important part is the herd replacement, so the younger cows that are substituting the old dairy cows. Here it's particularly the methane from enteric fermentation of these younger cows. The second large share, with around 40%, comes from the enteric fermentation of the dairy cows, and another almost 40% in the greenhouse gas budget is the greenhouse gases from the feed production, in particular the nitrous oxide from the nitrogen application. And here we would also include carbon sinks and sources, which are so far not included or set as 0, which is consistent with what we found in our long-term soil monitoring studies. And then a shorter contribution also comes from methane and nitrous oxide in manure management. So this is the kind of standard. And let's now look at two farms which managed to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of their milk production substantially by completely different approaches. The first one is the Dillinger farm, which is 100% pasture-based with quite an intensive short sward system, so probably comparable to what the systems in Brittany are. They converted part of their cropland to grassland and have a lot of clover on their grasslands, so they don't need synthetic fertilizer and have therefore low extra nitrogen input. They also managed to work with very low concentrate doses, and these concentrates are based on food byproducts, so they also come with a 0 carbon footprint into the farm. And you see, this farm manages to keep the same amount of milk yield, also 8,000 kilo per cow per year, as in the standard situation, but they lowered the footprint to something around 0.9 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. So they reduced the CO2 footprint by 30% compared to the standard. And the main reason is in the yellow part. So long-lived cows with lower amount and need for herd replacement, and the largest contribution comes from the own feed production, which is very efficient because of the pasture system. So you don't need a lot of energy, you don't need a lot of nitrogen, and also you reduce methane and nitrous oxide from manure management because you just have the animal droppings on the pasture itself. So intensive and pasture-based as a very efficient solution. The second farm example has a similar low greenhouse gas footprint, but produces a lot more milk per cow. So a highly intensive system with a focus on feed efficiency and a high milk yield per cow. The pasture is just for the herd replacement. And in addition, this farm has a biogas plant for the manure, which reduces the greenhouse gas emissions from the manure management. And here you see that they have a low greenhouse gas footprint from the herd replacement, which is a very clear management option. They have a similar greenhouse gas production for the feed production as in the standard case, but due to the higher productivity, they end up with a lower greenhouse gas footprint per kilogram of milk. So when we summarize this a little bit, the options we have on a farm is feed efficiency, high life yield of milk. I don't say annual milk yield, but I say lifelong milk yield for each cow, biogas, and a lot of pastures with clover and low concentrate doses, and if concentrates, then based on food byproducts. But we have many more options that we can do. We see that healthy long-lived cows are a key to reduce the footprint of the herd replacement and use the calves then for meat. We probably could reduce the footprint in the enteric fermentation by breeding activities, the longer perspective, of course, and by feed additives. There are a few on the market which reduce the methane emissions by 10 to 15%, and they are already included in the mitigation options of some EU countries. Germany is starting a little bit, but it's not yet widespread. We have seen the key role of grasslands because pastures with a high feed quality can really reduce the carbon footprint of milk. Grassland is the main feed resource, and using grasslands also maintains the high carbon stock compared to croplands. And by pasture, we also reduce the carbon footprint in the manure management. When we look at soil carbon, we have to consider the special case of grassland on organic soils, which is probably also currently treated in the parallel session at the conference. The reason is that drained organic soils lose a lot of soil carbon, and typically we have greenhouse gas emissions here in the order of 30 to 40 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare and year. Even if we have a highly productive system and we imagine the entire farm works on organic soils, this would immediately double to triple the carbon footprint per each kilogram of milk. And you can imagine in a system where the dairy companies have a big competition on sustainability, this type of milk will have more and more difficulty to be sold on the market. So the option is to raise the water table on the grasslands, but keep them in fodder production, which is to some extent possible. This means we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the feed here by around 50%. We are not yet at the same level as the mineral soils, but already a lot better. And we want to keep the soils in animal production. But we will also lose a certain amount of feed and feed quality due to the more extensive types of system. In our study, we lost about 15% of the feed amount and 15% of the protein content. So in total, 30% of the protein in the feed. So you would need to compensate that on the mineral soils nearby by clover systems, for instance. In my summary, even if we have some carbon sequestration in the grasslands in the order of magnitude just shown by Hélène, we would not see much of that in the entire carbon footprint of a dairy farm or a kilogram of milk, because the other sources are much higher. But of course, grassland is an important feed resource, and it has a potential low carbon footprint in milk and also in beef, in particular if it's a well-managed pasture. So far, carbon in grassland soils is not yet generally considered in carbon footprints, and the greenhouse gas calculators, I'm in line here with Hélène. We have to be careful about drained organic soils as a feed resource. And I've shown you diverse management options for a low carbon footprint in dairy farms, which are really site and farm specific. So a detailed analysis of that is necessary, and greenhouse gas tools to do that on the necessary level of detail are already available, not only by ourselves, but also in France, in the international community, like the Cool Farm tool. And here I stop, and thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much for the interesting presentation and questions for that. No, then I have one. Then after this, what is needed for the calculation of the tool? And is it possible that farmers can use it?
For the Bavarian farmers, we make it relatively simple. We have an online application where the Bavarian standard values are already inserted, and you can play with the tool and insert your own values wherever you have them available and wherever you want, and play with the system and see where you can, where you stand and where you can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. In the meantime, there's also an online interface available where you can come in with a front end that makes the whole thing a little bit more applicable to farmers. And we have defined in the German researcher community here kind of minimum standard set of individual data a farm would need, in particular the milk yield, the feed they use, the typical production system, and some values they usually use in their economic accounts anyway. And so this is the kind of standard you would need to do a solid carbon footprint for your dairy company, for instance.
Okay, fine. What's the question?
Now I'm coming late, but in the presentation at the end we are putting focus on grassland, and just to know what is the meaning of grassland. Is it permanent grassland or temporary grassland used in a crop rotation? In which kind of?
I just talked about permanent grasslands. We also have sward systems in our croplands, but we consider them as part of the cropland system and not as grasslands.
Hi, Annette, this is Francesca. I'm sorry that you are not here. I would have loved to see you again after so many years. Anyway, your tool, do you have a spreadsheet calculator, or do you use process-based models to predict those emissions?
We use the equations of the German National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. I wouldn't say it's process-based, but it's more than a simple spreadsheet.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Then we come to the next presentation of Virginia Bravier. from the INIA Institute from Uruguay, far away. And she quantifies carbon and nitrogen fluxes in pastures and cropping agro ecosystems to advance sustainable intensification and sea sequestration. And she integrates osmosis, long-term field experiments, surveys, and isotope techniques to closely advise farmers and policymakers to translate findings into the practice. And the presentation is soil carbon stock in temperate grasslands of South America and overlooked reservoir.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Good day. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this conference, of this great conference. And in particular, I'd like to thank the dialogue between the Uruguayan and German government who allowed us to be here today and to bring us our perspective on soil carbon stocks and on temperate grasslands in South America. Just a bit first of an outline of my presentation. Okay. So a bit of context of the grasslands in our region, which is the natural biome, and what is the land use and the land use change that we've been through, and in particular the case of Uruguay, that's where I'm coming from. Then about the soil carbon stocks assessments in these grasslands and integrated grasslands with croplands. We have long-term experiments, and I'm going to show very briefly some key issues that we have found within these long-term experiments, and talk about national scale soil surveys on soil carbon stocks when we improve our native grassland, and some final remarks on the role of the grasslands and pastures in sequestration and conservation, and some food for thoughts for conservation policies and intensives. So first, for those of you who are not familiar with our biome, the Pampas and Campos biome is the largest area of temperate grasslands in the region of South America. It covers about 70 million hectares. It goes across the Great Central Eastern Plain in Argentina. It covers all Uruguay and southern Brazil. Our climate it has a range of 20 degrees in the north to 13 degrees in the south of this biome. So it's like I found in many parts of the world, when we talk about South America, they think of more of the tropical area. Well, if you go south enough, you get to this temperate area. We have a grasslands as a native biome, so never. We didn't cut the trees to have a pasture. The pastures are our native ecosystem. So we have a precipitation range between 400 millimeters to 1500 in the whole region. So what is the vegetation? As I just mentioned, there is not a native forest, it's just native grasslands. It's a mix of C3 and C4 grasses. We have annual and perennial grasses. It's you can even find in 1 meter square regular countings of 30 species, greatest amounts of 60, and if you look at in the same meter square, but in a full sward we have counters of 150 species. So thinking about a biome of biodiversity, here's one. This is not only a diversity in plants, but you can find about 100 species of grassland birds among the 500 that have been identified in the region. It is based on fertile soils, so it's generally suitable for agriculture. Some areas are marginal for agriculture, but some others are suitable. And that's what's driving our land use change in the last years. If we look at what has happened with the land cover, in the last couple of decades, we have lost about 9% of the remaining area we had in the 2001. If we look at the natural woody vegetation, is kind of like the same. We have a little increase in average and region is kind of like the same. We see the grasslands coming down, and it's the dropping areas coming mostly to agricultural and more intensive agricultural land areas. So we just mentioned, I'm going to talk about more on the case of our country. This is, remember, this is our natural vegetation. We mostly have relatively low input systems. So these issues of having a nitrogen surplus is not the common situation. You may find some spots, but it's not. We still have about 55 to 70% of natural grassland cover. About 50% of planted pastures, and we have an integration of crop and pasture systems in our cropping area. So, but still we don't escape, let's say, this general trend of an intensification. So we have lost in the last 10 years about 1 million hectares. It has gone to cropland, to forestland. We have a reduced amount of zone species. Of pastures, I mean, and we have had this trend of intensification. If we look at the decades here, we have a trend of coming down the growth, but then an intensification that's been in our, let's say, in our highest area of croplands, and the cropping intensity has been raised, so we can have 2 crops per year because of our temperature. So this is kind of intensification we are looking at. So it's a record area of cropland. So we wonder what are the consequences of this land use change and these intensifications in terms of carbon nitrogen cycling. Can we actually sequester carbon in this condition? Then for how long? Which are the best management practices? So we have learned from long-term experiments that when we integrate grasslands and croplands, we have soil recovery during the time we have the grasslands, and then we have carbon losses during the cropping phase. Then we would plant the soil, the pastures, and recover the soil again, and we would balance this situation. So the traditional role of pasture was not only the forest production, also the biological nitrogen fixation, because I said we are relatively low input systems, so legumes introduction was an important source, and of course the carbon storage in this recovery. When we get the pastures out of the system, then we see some deterioration in extraction. If we compare different systems, this is from the eldest long-term experiment in South America that we have at INEA. The continuous cropping system would drop the carbon in the soil. This is measured data and model. Then if we add fertilizer, we get a bit better, but we are still losing carbon. If we were in a cropping system and then convert to an integrated system with grassland, we see an increase. But then if we start with these integrated systems, we see this kind of shift, but we kind of like maintain the carbon in the soil. But then one of the questions is, okay, if you are in a degraded system, then you introduce a pasture within the rotation, and you increase your carbon, so you are making a contribution to carbon sequestration. But then if you look at this system and also to the system that has been integrated from the very beginning, which had the pasture, the perennial pasture from the very beginning, which you think had made the best contribution to climate? This one that has an increase in carbon from certain degradation situation, or the one that never lost this carbon in the first place? We release it to the atmosphere. Well, we have analyzed the isotope signal from this and the radiocarbon signal from this long-term experiment in contrasting systems. And what we learned is that we actually have the soil in the carbon in the soil that we have is actually very, very old. And only when we look at these integrated systems, only about 8% of the soil carbon present in the soil entered during the time of the experiment. So the best thing that we are actually doing with our pastures there is avoiding losses. Of course, we are making inputs. The new inputs enter a labile pool. This labile pool, actually 50% is lost within the first year. That helps us avoid from the most stable pool. So again, the role of pastures here seems to be to preserve very old carbon in the soil. So you can think, okay, that's when we compare the integration system with the cropping system. But then, of course, 60 years old experiment started with tillage. What happens if we have no tillage in those systems? Well, we have another 10 experiment that was always under no tillage. It's more than 20 years ago. This is data from 26 years old. And what we see is that whether we have our product as grain or as forage, really the big difference is between the systems that have a continuous cropping or the system that integrates a perennial pasture somehow. And these are the ones that resemble more to the native practice. That is the best case scenario we can have. So we're looking at about 20% less carbon if we convert to crop. So, okay, but then you see, okay, this is our best case scenario. Really? Can we improve that carbon? We want to have a contribution to climate that we can claim for additionality, right? So can we improve our soil carbon stocks on native grasslands? Well, if we look around, one of the options is to be the inclusion of legumes and fertilizations in grasslands. In native grassland is an extended management practice that farmers would use to increase the productivity and therefore the carbon inputs to the soil. So we think maybe there's an opportunity there for soil carbon increase. However, we know that there are many factors affecting at the same time, meaning the stocking density, how much really of the fertilizer you put, is really the legume staying for long in the soil, many things. So we have seen in some cases, there are some results that go on the other way. So it's really a challenge to have this very well quantified. So we did this national field survey in which we looked in particular to only these improved grasslands that had been there for at least 20 years with the same management, and a case that had been even previously studied for the permanence of the legume and for the nitrogen fixation that we had. So we were sure we had really this time frame in which we could try to capture this soil carbon stocks difference. So we went there and we did a paired sample of a native grassland that had on the same soil, that had the previously managed in the same way, and we could really make a fair comparison. And we took samples on vertical increments up to 60 centimeters. We measured the density and total carbon nitrogen content, pH, and then calculated our carbon nitrogen stocks. Then the first conclusion was there was really an ample variation in the carbon stocks and in the nitrogen stocks. So things for those farmers who would like to calculate their carbon stocks and based on this general charts data of IPCC, it's mission impossible because it's really a high variation in the stocks. Then we look at the data and we have the native grasslands and the improved grasslands, and they mostly fall on the 119. So we were kind of like a bit disappointed because, well, we cannot increase soil carbon stock by these management practices on average. Of course, we look at that and we see 2 points that are out of the range of the variation. Okay, we want to look there. Those were a couple of grasslands that were a little bit degraded. So then it seems that our room for carbon sequestration would be those systems which had the soil degraded, and then we can work with that. But then we have many cases, and a great area of the country that is actually sustaining that carbon stocks without doing this land use change. But it's really hard to demonstrate that they're contributing to climate. So, final remark: role for carbon, the grasslands for carbon sequestration, the role of grasslands for carbon sequestration. We have to keep in mind that this temperate grasslands region has lost about 9% of this remaining area. We have just seen that when we lose these native systems, the way to keep the carbon in the soil closer to what it was in the native conditions is to integrate these perennial pastures within the cropland. This allows us to preserve this old carbon. Then the improved management for native grasslands to add these legumes and phosphorus didn't really showed an increase in carbon stock changes. It rather showed this ample variation in stocks. Then, so the opportunity for carbon sequestration, but this management practice, well, it seems and consider the need for additionality. So then, after this, some thoughts. First, the results highlight that nominally managed native grasslands are a best case scenario. In addition to the value of reference, if you want to do these calculations with new reference values, the two IPCC and local values. Under the global challenges, these systems are vulnerable, considering that most intensives are for increasing carbon stocks and not for maintaining, and that the market sometimes is, the last couple of decades, is asking to move to cropland if you can. So, several initiatives that tend to focus on these regeneration practices are effective for building this additional soil carbon on degraded land, and that is a great thing, and that is very valuable that we have these tools now to work on. However, under this bioeconomy framework, an opportunity arises to build policies that may value the carbon that is already there and that that help us maintain the carbon in the soil and produce at the same time. So we need to find new tools to value the grasslands. And I'm glad this is, we actually even having the grassland session within this conference. So it's like, I think it's a great news for us. It's showing like, okay, there was a first big step on starting to value the carbon increase in the soils of degraded systems, but then there's more to be done, and this is one of the issues that we need to face. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and open.
Do you have a question? Maybe
one. Curiosity.
Maximum 2.
I think some edges in your grassland, is it possible?
Hedges?
Yeah.
Well, not really hedges. There are some farmers have what we call like we plant some trees for shelter.
Yeah,
but maybe they're not in the.
That doesn't matter.
There are some. Okay, again.
And did you measure if it adds some carbon in your grassland to have trees on it in your trial?
Well, we have another relatively new long-term experiment, let's say, platform that is run by some colleagues of the university that we collaborate with them on silvopasture systems. And we hope in the future we can have more data on that. Then there are some data on just forest system. And some changes happen in the soil that may not be so good, let's say. Of course, you have to.
Yeah, you mentioned at the beginning that there's like a very high difference in the species richness. Did you also look at the soil carbon and map it against each other? So you know places with low species richness, and you understand what I mean?
The amount of the species richness I mentioned is for native grasslands.
Okay, so you don't have variability inside native grassland, or like, yeah, just more intensively.
Well, you can have more degraded grasslands that have less species richness. Yes. Still, we don't have data to say how many species losses corresponds to how much carbon loss. But we have some data on one experiment that started as an improved pasture and then degraded. Then it was invaded by Cynodon, and then we lost a lot of native species there. And then we have 20% soil carbon losses after 24 years. So it could be related, but we cannot say like you lose 10 species, it's a certain amount of carbon.
Thank you. So maybe afterwards, okay? So I don't know how long is the next presentation. Yeah, thank you. Minutes, and this was a little bit longer, and maybe you can discuss it later. And now we have the last presentation by Henry, which is associate professor in of the Grassland University of Technology in Australia, far away, and he has long-term experience at the nexus of climate, land use, and soil health. Yeah. Then we will hear something about protecting and increasing soil organic carbon in temperate grasslands and rangelands. We give a global overview.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation, Steve, particularly at the session on grasslands. So I'd just like to reiterate what Virginia said. It is really great to have a session on grasslands because often grassland, the grassy ecosystems, are a bit neglected compared to cropping soils or forests. So it's good. And I've noticed that there's been a couple of questions about grasslands. What sort of grasslands? Are they native grasslands? Are they permanent? And I think that's one of the issue about grasslands. They're highly varied, highly diverse. They cover an enormous area and they're not well defined. And what I'm going to be talking about with soil organic carbon is partly because the estimates of the amount of carbon that can be sequestered in grasslands or rangelands vary enormously. And one reason for that is that they're not talking about the same area or the same ecosystems. Now, I'm not going to try to resolve that issue. It's just too big a topic. But I'll talk mostly about extensive grazing lands in with native grasses. So a bit like following on from Virginia. We went from highly modified, intensively managed grasslands in Germany and France to the other end of the scale. So I needed to put that context in there. But no matter what we call them, they have enormous economic value, social value, cultural value, environmental value. And I'll focus on soil carbon, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that that's just one of their environmental values. Now, I'm talking about it today partly because of this enormous value. But 2026, as we heard from the UNCCD, has been designated the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists. About 40% of rangelands, something like that, are also called grasslands. So we won't talk about the savannas. And in view of that, and in view of the interest in the topic of soil carbon in these lands, the 4 per 1,000 initiative has just put out a soil carbon note on safeguarding soil carbon in rangelands, a key to climate and ecosystem resilience. Now that soil carbon note is number 5 in a series that have been produced by the Secretariat and the Scientific and Technical Committee, and they usually look at topics that are a little bit difficult or controversial. So this one's now available on the website, and I've noted it there, but at the end of my talk, there'll be a QR code if anyone's interested in downloading it. So going back to the topic, there's a map of rangelands, and what I've highlighted the colours for there are the areas and the temperate grasslands and shrublands, which is within the scope of what we're trying to cover in this meeting. And then there's a global extended grasslands map, which is roughly intersecting. But they're the sort of areas that we're going to be talking about. So rangelands and grasslands cover about 50% of the terrestrial land surface altogether. And in the temperate region, it probably makes up 15 to 20% of that total. Highly significant. There are the maps again. And if you look at the ITPS soil organic carbon stock map in the top 30 centimetres and just get roughly the idea where they are, you can see that they're relatively low in soil carbon generally. A lot of areas have less than 40 tonnes and very few are much over 100 tonnes per hectare. So that's the sort of soil carbon we're looking at. But the question that I want to look at particularly is how much can we alter that by the way we manage those lands and manage them for ruminant livestock production predominantly. So that's the global picture. And if I go back to a more or less case study, Australia is an interesting case study because more than 50% of the land area is used for grazing livestock. In the map on your left, the green areas, I don't know what's happening to my voice. The green areas are grazing lands. The rangeland boundary is in yellow. So roughly from about there down, can be called temperate, and a lot of that grazing land is what I'm going to be talking about today. So if you line that up with the soil carbon stock map for Australia. Now this map was built on many thousands of sample cores that were taken and a modelling approach. Now we're reasonably confident in our broad scale, but on a regional scale or a smaller scale, it's highly variable. And Australian grazing lands are a vast area, but they're characterised by very infertile soils mostly. These temperate areas down here have high soil carbon, but most of that area has less than 40 tonnes. In the centre, it's often less than 10 tonnes of carbon per hectare. The amount of carbon in those soils is driven by the soil type, but also by the highly variable climate. The rainfall in those areas is generally low, but more than that, it varies enormously. And with that variation in rainfall from year to year, in a low rainfall area, the soil carbon stocks also fluctuate. They can be lost quite rapidly in drought years. So within that, sorry, I forgot to click that. You'll probably all be familiar with the Köppen climate zones. But just to give you that context, but also if you look at the soil carbon stocks and match it to the rainfall, and that's only an average rainfall map, the small one on the bottom, you can see the influence that rainfall has. And in fact, if you do a survey, about 75 to 90% of the variation in soil carbon stocks from one point, between points, can be determined and shown to be due to rainfall and soil type. So the influence of management is quite small, but it is significant. And it's significant for a number of reasons. It's significant for all the soil health reasons, for all the ecosystem service reasons that we've talked about a lot in this meeting. It's also important in looking at the expectations for soil carbon sequestration in these areas of land. Globally, a lot of countries are considering soil carbon sequestration in meeting Paris Agreement targets. Australia has soil carbon included in its national inventory, but also in its NDC. And if there are very wide variations in estimates of how much carbon can be put into those soils by better management, it's really difficult to factor that in when you determine your NDC. So in Australia's long-term plan for meeting net zero, they're looking in some of the estimates to a significant contribution from soil carbon and soil carbon in grazing land. So we want to get a better idea of what that number is. And that prompted the study I'm going to talk about in Australia. But it's also being pushed by farmers. Farmers want to improve the condition of their soil, the health of their soil, for productivity reasons, because about a third of the soil carbon from the country's pastoral lands has been lost since it's been managed by us. So farmers want to improve their soil health, but they also have an interest in the possibility of getting income from soil carbon credits that might be sold as offsets or might be used to offset their own livestock emissions, their own on-farm emissions. This figure here shows the cumulative projects registered under our national carbon crediting system that you've heard about from Dr. Wensley, and I spoke about this a little bit yesterday. It just shows that there has been a real upturn in interest in registering projects. Partly that's been driven by a new version of the method in 2021 that was more usable and allowed other means of measuring carbon that were more cost effective. So it gave better financial viability to projects. And if you look at where those projects are located, I hope you can see the red spots. The red spots are locations. The size isn't meant to be an aerial extent of the project. But if you can see the projects and think back to the map of where the grazing lands were and the temperate grazing lands, a lot of them are in this area here and down here. And a lot of those projects have as their activity to improve carbon management of the pastures and the livestock. So we want to understand, really what the evidence is that we can increase our soil carbon. So to look at this question, we firstly did a global literature scan just to see what the numbers might look like. And what that scan told us, mainly looking at review studies and meta-analyses, that different individual experiments and studies varied a lot in their quality, in how they measured things, and the management practices they looked at. And they varied in their results. Few of those studies had robust data. They may have only looked at percent carbon and not stocks. They may have only looked for a year or two, which doesn't really give us an idea of what's happening. So we wanted to isolate studies that looked at persistence as well and additionality and had a change that could reasonably be attributable to management rather than we had a good rainfall season, so the grass grew well. The analysis was confounded by location-specific factors and management history that we had no way of getting a handle on, so whether the soil was degraded or not, and Virginia emphasised the importance of that. But putting that aside, for some management strategies, there was consistent evidence of positive impacts on soil carbon. So there was something to start on. And if we looked at the sort of management that was done, we could pull these out. So to increase soil organic carbon, things that worked were oversowing native pastures with more productive species, and particularly with legumes. Mostly our soils are very low in nitrogen. Or if you restored grassland that had been converted to cropping back to permanent grassland, you got an increase again. Now, these are well-known effects. They're not surprising, but they came out in the literature. As important as building soil carbon in rangelands is protecting what's there. It's an enormous store of carbon. It's estimated that about a third of the terrestrial carbon stocks are actually in rangelands. And most of that is held below ground, roots and soil. We want to protect that because the risk to climate from losing that is probably greater than what we're going to gain by improving management. So avoiding prolonged high stocking rates is one way of minimising the loss from the way we manage that land. Overgrazing is a big one because it lays the surface bare. You've got no inputs of organic matter coming from after overgrazing. And protecting permanent grassland from conversion is the other one. Now, they're very, very basic and very well known, but it was a starting point. We then looked at the studies done in Australia and wanted to identify, before we did that, we tried to identify the sources of inconsistency in what was reported. And we could see some of them. There was differences in the way they described soil carbon stocks and the definitions of practices. So you weren't always comparing like with like. The complexity of MRV, of measurement, of soil organic carbon dynamics, particularly in variable climate situations, and the interactions and trade-offs with other greenhouse gases and whether that was accounted for contributed to the inconsistency that we saw in between studies. And then there's, the location-specific factors. And I don't need to talk about the complexity of the dynamics. We've heard a lot about that. We've heard a lot about how soil carbon sequestration has to be permanent if it's going to be used as a climate change mitigation strategy. And if it's going to be rewarded in a carbon crediting system, it has to be accurately measured and additional. So we had an idea of those factors as well. That's the non-CO2s. We found from the range of studies, after we pulled them all out, over 200 studies, and then filtered them down to those that had reliable data on carbon stock change to at least 30 centimetres that was measured for a decade, close to a decade or longer. And we divided the sort of management practices into grazing management, what you did with your livestock, pasture management, or land conversion. Now, there weren't enough data to do a statistical analysis. They were too variable and it was too unreliable. But what I want to present here is just the range that you can get from different studies, and the fact that, while some of them, legumes in the native grass pastures obviously gives an increase, with most of them it was non-significant and reasonably variable. So the summary of what we found was that there is potential for increasing carbon despite the climate and the soil type constraints. There are opportunities. But for many practices or locations, sequestration rates were modest, but they could still be significant in total area. So although there's small changes, the areas are large. The sort of numbers that we were getting, and these aren't statistically significant enough to know how far we can extrapolate from the locations where the particular studies were done. They range from close to zero, less than 0.1, up to about 0.4, so 0.4 or 0.5 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. So they are reasonably modest, but they are there. And the implications of those values for offsetting, insetting, and for co-benefits are what our policy people want to know. It's what our farmers need to know. And we as scientists want to understand it better. So we've got to think about these things differently. For offsetting, you've got those constraints on the integrity of carbon offsets. And you've got to look at those values that meet those requirements. But for insetting, it's not quite as rigid, and there's a lot of pressure coming. Even we can see it now. Woolworths are putting pressure on livestock producers to show that they're managing the carbon intensity of their product as Scope 3 inputs into their carbon footprint, because they've made commitments to their shareholders. So this supply chain effect is starting to show up. And the other benefit, of course, is soil health and environmental co-benefits. And that has production and economic value. And farmers are most interested in remaining profitable and sustainable in the long term. And that's where that value comes in. So this table is modified from what's in the soil carbon note. And it's the same sort of value expressed in a qualitative way on the soil organic carbon impact. And so it's the same data, really, converted to temperate grasslands. But what we've added to it is a column for potential co-benefits, because that is likely to drive adoption. And if you don't have adoption by farmers, you're not going to have a big impact anywhere. So this is the important data. And while we did that in a very qualitative way, it was more expert opinion than anything else. No, I'm not the expert, the other people that input. We also have some backing for that. And I'd just like to focus on this just for a minute. This is the results of a meta-analysis that was done in Australia, mainly in temperate grazing lands. And the soil carbon is in red. And if you look at, I haven't talked about grazing management because it's a difficult one, apart from high stocking rate driving soil carbon down. for either stocking rate or whether using rotational grazing, there's an insignificant effect. The way to read these graphs is where the dotted line is, that's a 0. If it crosses the dotted line, it's a non-significant effect. This is log response ratio. And but if it's to one side, there is a significant effect. So in these cases, herbage mass and ground cover, non-continuous grazing, so that's some form of rotational management, does improve how much production you have and the ground cover, and that's important. Similarly with stocking rate, you can see the lower stocking rate does improve some factors, herbage mass in particular and ground cover, but just about plant growth rate as well. But it's important to have some data on this meta-analysis to back that up. Even though it's not quantifiable yet, we've got evidence that good management does pay off in terms of sustainability of the system. So with that, I'd just like to give you the opportunity to scan this if anyone is interested. But otherwise, you can find it on the 4 per 1,000 website if you look for soil carbon notes. And the 4 earlier ones are also there, and you're well worth a read. So I'd like to thank all the members of the SPC committee that contributed, and these are my Australian colleagues who contributed. So thank you very much for your attention.
Nice presentation, and for the insight of Australia. Is there any questions? So then you, then we run outside the time. No, you at first, and then you.
Just it was nice to listen both presentations at the same time, because maybe it's not the same characteristic, but it's outside of Europe at least. And I see in your case, in last case, when you introduce new species and legume, it seems to be good and have good effect. If we compare with Uruguay, it was not completely the case. In fact, if you try to introduce legume, it was not so positive. It's not the same, but impact of the legume is not the same.
I think our soils are very low in nitrogen. So you overcome a limiting factor with nitrogen. And what some studies have shown is that effect, that increase, levels off after about a decade. So the soil reaches a new nitrogen status, which is somewhat better, but it doesn't keep going up. So the effect is fairly limited.
In our case, we saw an effect in cases of a degraded soil, but then on average, on well-preserved grasslands.
Yeah, actually, thank you very much. I'd rather like to mention something, and thanks for mentioning also the International Year of Rangeland and Pastoralists. And I would like to draw the attention on that, because it's next year's, and I think it's very important to make clear the importance of those practices that are also being lost. You know, like we've heard in all the conferences now. There's so many things that we are losing knowledge about, and these are really ancestral knowledges that we are losing. So I think it's very important to to make those practices visible, and everyone who's interested in that international year, there's a web page that you can consult, and there are groups that are working in different countries. The page is IYRP, International Year of Rangeland and Pastoralists.info. So if you're interested, you can have a look at that.
Yes, thank you very much. Then I can also make an appointment to another year. So 1 year later, we have the 100-year International Grassland Congress in Leipzig. And if you are interested, then you can also search for IGC 2027 and also contact me. Then I can provide some informations. And before we had this conference, I thought we store a lot of carbon inside grasslands. And so we have seen that we lost also a lot of carbon. And for that, we need a lot of research and go, especially in the practice, to enhance the carbon in the soil and that we have healthy soils. And thank you for your attention.